Thank you for being here. I know we're running slim for a lot of different reasons, but I appreciate you being here. Always encouraging to spend time together. As we look at this morning, obtaining the crown. You know, we've looked at the crown all year in First and Second Timothy, and next month we're going to dive into Titus. Paul, in this particular passage, talks about his crown of righteousness, the goal. That's why we're here. That's our that's our hope. Is that one day, as the book of Revelation puts it, if we remain faithful unto death, that there will be for us a crown of righteousness. So we're going to look this morning and examine or survey, perhaps more appropriately, what Paul says that he's done in order to obtain that crown. How do we get there? What does that look like in our everyday life? Very practical and very important lesson as we think about these things. And as Lou just read for us, there's a lot of things in this passage that are pertinent to us. As we think about in verse 6, what is happening to Paul as he obtains this crown, let's read it together. He says, "For I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come." We're talking about the timing of Paul. We're talking about what is going on in Paul's life as he gets ready to depart. As he is parting out of this life, we read it in verse 6. We read what Paul is thinking about. Now, again, this is probably some of the very last words that we at least have in our account of what Paul has written. I am already being poured out as a drink offering. We consider several things from this particular verse, but we consider first the imminence of his leaving. We see that in this word, am. I am. It's not future, right? As he writes to the church at Philippi in chapter 1, he says, I can't choose between the two. Whether to stay with you, that's better for your account, but my hope, my goal, what I really want to do is to leave and to be with the Lord. Here in this passage, in contrast to that, is it's happening. It's imminent. I am already being poured out. It's not in the future. I will be poured out. It's not in the past. I already have been poured out, but it is imminent. As we think about Paul's death, probably beheaded since he was a Roman soldier or a Roman citizen, rather. Maybe he can hear the knife or the sword being sharpened in the background. Or maybe he sees people who were there with him on death row, we might say, and they're not there any longer. But he has this image of this imminent departure. It's happening right now, parting out of this life. But you also see here in verse 6, not necessarily the imminence of it, but consider this: the sacrificial nature that Paul is talking about. I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. Now, if I remember right, the first time that we read about a drink offering or something like this is when Jacob is promised. There is a time when Jacob leaves and he flees Esau because Esau's trying to kill him. That's what he promised. I'm going to kill Jacob. So Jacob leaves, and you remember he sleeps, and at night he's sleeping with a pillow. It wasn't a Tempur-Pedic pillow that he was sleeping with. It was the rock, you remember. And he had this incredible encounter with the Lord, and he lifts up that rock as a memorial for him as to what happened. And he poured this offering over that rock. And I believe that's the first time, if I'm correct, that we have this drink offering image. But as we read about it in the Old Testament, it's an interesting study. I've read, and I can't prove it, but it seems to infer here in Paul's writing that it was preliminary. It was something that was done preliminary to the sacrifice being placed on the altar. Now, we're probably more familiar with the sin offering, the peace offering, and the things, the grain offering, the things that go along with that. But with that, most of the time was this drink offering. So Paul sees himself as this offering on the altar of God. And he says, what's happening now is I'm being poured out as this drink offering. And you can imagine the fire being kindled. And you can imagine the smoke as this liquid is poured over it, sprinkled over it, or whatever it is. The smoke that rises from that particular altar. And perhaps if it's poured on top of that meat, I don't know, or before that, it doesn't really matter. Perhaps there's that sizzling sound. Paul says, I'm already being poured out as this drink offering to the Lord. And it reminds me as the smoke rises, right? How the Lord smelt the pleasing aroma of sacrifices several times in the Old Testament. And that smell pleased him. It reminds me of what Paul writes in 2 Corinthians as he says and describes our relationship to the world, the non-religious world, that we are an aroma of Christ. To those who are saved, it's a sweet smelling aroma. To God, it's a sweet smelling aroma. But as we walk, have you ever been behind somebody that is loaded with perfume? It's like, good night. Or maybe the middle school locker room, and you walk in and it's just like Axe body spray everywhere. In a sort of way, that's how we ought to be, this aroma, not a stench. It's a sweet smelling aroma that everywhere we go, it's this thing that you can't see, you can't put your finger on it, but boy, is it there. We are like Christ to the world, or at least we ought to be. So perhaps that's what Paul is thinking, this sweet smelling aroma that is preliminary to the sacrifice of his body, the death of his body, perhaps preliminary. But it reminds me of a passage in Romans chapter 12 that Paul writes. And you remember what it says there? He's talking to this Roman congregation, this congregation at Rome, and he writes this in verse 1. He says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. It's that same type of image that Paul is saying, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering to God. This sacrificial life that I've lived. Paul is, as he writes Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, as we know it, Paul is living it. And now he's about to prove it through his death. It's a sacrificial life. Then you also, from verse 6, you gather this, I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come. Poured out. Being poured out. In this sense, he's following the example of Jesus. This is, as you can tell from reading verse 6, the tone or the the way that the verb is written, it's a passive verb. I am being poured out. It's not I am pouring out, but it's something that is happening to him. So you hand even in death, okay? Even in death, Paul is allowing God to drive the car. God is still in control as he's hearing the sword being sharpened. Paul knows that God is in total control. It's this same passive sense that we read that Jesus says about himself. You remember this passage, and I'll read it real quick, and you're familiar with it because it's read frequently. But in Luke chapter 22 and verse 20, it says, as Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, and likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, Jesus, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. God is in control. We're handing it over to him. But Paul, I can't help but to think that he is probably picturing this same type of imagery of Jesus' blood being poured out, knowing that his blood was also about to be poured out. So you see in verse 6, you notice the parting of Paul. It's certainly imminent, sacrificial, and it's following the example of Jesus in almost every way, except Jesus' example is supreme. And then we dive into verse 7. And this is the productivity of Paul as we examine his life. In reflection, it says this: I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. We have a series in verse 7, a series of three perfect tense verbs. These are things, as we think about the perfect tense, it may mean nothing to you. When you think about it, it's something that has happened in the past, but it has present effects. I have fought the good fight. And since I have fought the good fight, henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. I have kept the faith. I have finished, and henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness. So it's something that has happened in the past, and he seems as if his life is almost already over, right? But consider those. He has fought the good fight. Every single one of these, it's interesting as you read it, every single one of these has the definite article in front of it, doesn't it? I have fought a good fight. No. I have finished a race. No. I have kept a faith. It's not what it says at all, is it? The faith, the fight, the race. He's got one thing on his mind, and it's this Christian race that he is running. We notice in the fight first. I have fought the good fight. Contrary to many people, one of the fastest growing religions in the United States is Islam. The Islamic belief is that they are fighting a physical fight. That is not what we are talking about. If you back up and look at what Paul's already written in Ephesians chapter 6, starting in about verse 12, he describes the full armor of God. And every single one of those that you see in Ephesians chapter 6 is spiritual in nature. We fight a spiritual battle. Or perhaps in John chapter 18, when Jesus, questioned by Pilate, "Are you the king?" Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." We're fighting a spiritual battle. We're not at war. Listen to me. We're not at war with people. We are at war with the devil. We are at war with sin, immorality. But by no stretch of the imagination is the Christian that follows Jesus at war with any person. And we need to understand that. I have fought the good fight, the first thing that he says. I have finished the race. Now, I don't like running at all. It's never, unless somebody's chasing me, I've never understood the point of it. But there are people that enjoy running for pleasure. The race that we are talking about, it's a race to be run, but it's by no stretch of the imagination, it's not a sprint. It's not, I'm going to do this real fast and then I'm going to move on with my life. It's a lifelong commitment. When you run long distances, in the times that I had to do it, when you run long distances, you move your concentration from point to point. As we run the Christian race, the good news about it is that we fix our eyes on one point. We don't have to move from thing to thing, and as we progress, we now look at this where we fix our eyes on Jesus, and we run with endurance the race that is set before us. But it's one of those races, and I'm a super competitive person. It's one of those races that finishing is winning. It's not one of those races where you got to be the first to get there. It's one of those races where if you cross the finish line, you are a winner. I have finished, right? I have finished the race. Now, I say both of those, but I want to put those in conjunction with what Paul, and we've already looked at this, but we looked at it a couple years ago, but what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, beginning in verse 24, he says this, "Do you not know that in a race all runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. We run. And we run with all of our might, and we fight with all of our might. Paul says, I fight and I run. I do it as if there's only going to be one person that's going to win. A lot of times we run the Christian race haphazardly, expecting and relying on God's grace. And I am as guilty of that as anyone. But that is not running the Christian race. That's allowing Satan to rule in your heart. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. And he says, I have kept the faith. Now, there's two, as we think about this word faith, there's two possible ways that we can understand that. And the first is that the faith, as in the faith, the Christian faith, the doctrine of Christianity. I have adhered to the doctrine of Christianity. Another way that particular phrase is used throughout the New Testament is the faith as in our life, our faithful life. And I think in many times, I believe this, and maybe it's just a political answer, but I believe it's vague because he means both. But when we don't keep the faith, the doctrine of Christianity, what we read about in the New Testament, then we veer off the course. And when we don't live the Christian life, then we veer off the course. And of course, our life will end. We will finish a race, but we're not going to finish the race. I have kept the faith. Fought the good fight. I have finished the race, and I have kept the faith. And then as we turn our attention to verse 8, we consider the promise. We have seen Paul's parting in verse 6. We have seen in verse 7. And now we turn our attention to verse 8. We consider the promise of God. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. Not only to me, but also to all who have loved his appearing. Consider this first of all. It's conditional. When we consider the Christian race and when we consider obtaining this crown, it is conditional. We were yesterday, we were in Louisville at our nephew's soccer match, and it was their last game. And everybody that was there got a trophy. Now, my nephew just destroyed the other team, but everybody got a trophy. Participation trophy. That's not biblical. When we consider the Christian race, when we consider the Christian fight, it's conditional. God doesn't hand participation trophies out to everyone. Thanks. Glad you signed up. Finally, the New King James says, ESV, henceforth. Other translations, therefore. So what's the therefore? What's the henceforth, therefore? Finally, what? Well, it's based on verse 7, isn't it? It's based on having fought the good fight. It's based on finishing the race, and it's based on keeping the faith. If you don't fight the good fight, if you don't finish the race, if you don't keep the faith, therefore is not there. Because there isn't a crown of righteousness. There is a very important word, a word that the denominational world needs to understand, and it's henceforth. It is conditional. The Christian race is conditional. If you follow, if you fight, if you run, if you keep, there is laid up for us a crown of righteousness. But also consider this. Not only is it conditional, but don't miss Paul's confidence in it. Henceforth, there is laid up. For me, it's not, there might be, or there should be, or I'm hoping that there is. This is the same type of mentality that we all, as we face the end of life, that we all want to have. But, and I know 100% that we are going to depend on the grace of God. But we ought to have that same type of confidence if we have fought the good fight, if we have finished the race, if we've kept the faith. If you can say those three things in verse 7, then you ought to be able to say with confidence, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness. Again, I know it's easier said than done. And I've been there, I've talked with people that are on death's doorstep, and they're saying, I don't know if I've done. Have you kept the faith? Have you fought the good fight? Have you finished the race? Then there is But the greatest part about this is the comprehensive nature of all of this in verse 8. Henceforth there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but now he's talking to me and you, but also to all who have loved his appearing. So the promise, as we think about this, is that it's for us, anyone, all, everybody. If you have loved his appearing, what appearing? Well, there's two possible scenarios. The appearing of Jesus in the incarnate flesh. Did you love the example? Did you love the life? Did you love what Jesus did for you? Or the appearing, as in the second coming of Jesus? Are you anticipating? Are you waiting? Are you longing for that moment? Perhaps, again, perhaps both are in view here. Do you love that? If you love that, and if you have fought the good fight, if you have finished the race, if you have kept the faith, then there is laid up for you the crown of righteousness. How do you obtain the crown? You do those three things, and you depend on the grace of God. Maybe you're not running the race. Get in the race, get baptized, have your sins washed away, and start running that race. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Or maybe that fight right now is just too hard and you need some prayers and encouragement. That's what the church is for. We're here for you. We want to pray with you. We want to pray for you. If you're subject to the invitation in any way, please come as we stand.